Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is Tom Laney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. At its core, the McFarland Center exists to encourage deeper engagement with important religious and ethical topics. We work in partnership with faculty, students, and visiting scholars to support research, teaching, and public inquiry on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. Lectures like this one that we're here for today are an important element of that work. One focus of our mission is Jewish Christian understanding, which is advanced through two initiatives: the Kraft-Hiatt program for Jewish Christian understanding, which brings us here today, and a scholarly program called Readings from the Roots, which employs scripture translation and preaching resources to help prevent anti-Jewish interpretations of scripture from the pulpit in Christian Sunday worship. Today's program is an opportunity to understand the scope and scale of a challenge that is urgent but may go unnoticed or underestimated by many Christians: understanding and responding to the rise of anti-Semitism and hate in both digital and public life. We live in an era when much of our civic, cultural, and religious conversation now unfolds online. Social media platforms, discussion forums, and digital networks shape how ideas circulate, how identities are formed, and how prejudice is expressed and amplified. These spaces offer powerful tools for connection, but they can also become environments in which misinformation, hostility, and hate spread with alarming speed. Making sense of the complex digital landscape requires careful attention and rigorous analysis. Our speaker today, Stephen Fransblow, brings that rigorous analysis to us. He serves as Chief Data and Technology Officer at the Blue Square Alliance Against Hate, an organization dedicated to advancing research and public understanding of anti-Semitism and other forms of bias in the United States. The Blue Square Alliance employs sophisticated, data-driven methodologies to study Americans' attitudes and behaviors related to Jewish hate. The organization systematically monitors more than 500 million social media posts each day, analyzing patterns of online discourse and surrounding anti-Semitism, Judaism, and Israel. Blue Square Alliance was launched in 2025 by the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism, founded in 2019 by Robert Kraft, a man with a long-standing connection to the college. Kraft's father-in-law, Jacob Hiatt, was a pivotal figure in the Worcester Jewish community, a Holocaust survivor, an honorary degree recipient, and a trustee of the college. Through a generous joint gift, Jacob, his wife Frances, their daughter Myra, and son-in-law Bob Kraft funded the Kraft-Hiatt program for Jewish understanding that brings us together today, and the Kraft-Hiatt professorship held by Professor Alan Avery Peck, my lead colleague in organizing these events. The Blue Square Alliance's work goes far beyond tracking the numbers or keywords. It seeks to understand context, narrative, and circulation. By grounding public conversations in evidence and careful analysis, Blue Square Alliance provides essential tools for educators, researchers, faith leaders, and policymakers. Stephen's work reminds us that addressing hatred requires intellectual rigor and sustained engagement. It calls us to observe the structures and systems that shape contemporary discourse and to consider how knowledge, technology, and dialogue can be mobilized in the service of justice and understanding. So please welcome Stephen Fransblow.
Thank you. And thank you for the college for hosting us today. My goal is to share our work, which, as you outlined, really takes a new form as we monitor online conversation and we look for how anti-Semitism transforms and what it looks like in today's world. To get there, I'm going to take a step back and just share a little bit about anti-Semitism over the ages, probably take 3 to 5 minutes there, and then get into our work. So that's a preview of what we're going to work through. And what we'll do is we'll work through the presentation that I have, and then if we have questions, we have the microphone and we'll work through those as well. So I'm really excited to be here, and I appreciate everyone joining us. My goal is to make it lively and hopefully leave you all some new things that you'll learn from today's topic. So as was highlighted, when you look back in the last 10 years, Robert Kraft saw the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where you had white supremacists marching and calling out slogans like "the Jews will not replace us." You had the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018, where 11 people were murdered. And in 2019, with all that happening, Robert created the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism. He saw that the hate was rising, and he saw it not only as a threat to the Jewish community, but as a threat to what he saw in the United States as a whole. And so our mission is to bring facts to the table and drive action to help folks understand the importance, and ultimately stand up to Jewish hate as they see it. My role is on the data and technology side. And so we leverage typical social listening tools to understand what that conversation looks like online, and then we bring that to life in our marketing. As we go through today's presentation, I'm going to bring you some of that marketing and some of the ads that we run so that you can see what that looks like and how that manifests itself in the work that we do. So why does this matter, right? So the American Jewish Council just released this about 2 weeks ago. So as the data person, I'm going to bring you some data. So 90% of American Jews today feel that they are less safe because of violent attacks in the last year in the United States. So if you think about those attacks, that would be primarily, there was a shooting outside the Jewish Museum in the Capitol after an American Jewish Council event last summer. There was a firebombing in Boulder, Colorado earlier last year. And although it wasn't in the United States, this impacted a lot of Jews internationally, which was the shooting in Australia in December at an event at the beach. So all of those things are driving a real heightened awareness around hatred and around anti-Semitism and feeling safe amongst the American Jews here today. Another fact is that just over half of Jews, so 50% of American Jews, have changed their behavior as a result of anti-Semitism. So my goal here is just to bring some of this data just to show the harm and the impact that this is having today on the Jewish community, right? And the last point, which is nearly 90% of Jews feel less safe and that anti-Semitism has increased as a result of the attacks of October 7th. So this is something that collectively Jews are definitely feeling and seeing on a daily basis in the last year and the last 2 years. And when you look at young people, nearly half of American Jews say that they were personally a target of anti-Semitism. And that is 47% is shown on the slide. And when you look at folks over 30, the ratio is only 28%. So young Jews are almost nearly double the amount of, they see nearly double the amount of anti-Semitism directed towards them as older folks. Another fact is that 1 in 4 Jewish students on American campuses feel excluded because of anti-Semitism from a group or any type of event. So this is, again, very much impacting young people and very much impacting all Jews. And this data was collected last year and was released about 2 weeks ago. So all very relevant and all very current. So that's why this matters. So I just want to take a moment and talk about what is anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism is one of the oldest forms of hatred, and two of the things that make it distinct is that it isn't limited to one religion or one identity or one country, right? It's been seen throughout time over the last 2,000 years, and it's changed. So as we talk about it over the next 3 or 4 minutes, what I want you to see is not necessarily one instance, but a pattern that changes over time and shifts. And the other thing is that it simultaneously casts Jews as both weak and strong. So there's these dichotomies that make it kind of unique. So when you look at anti-Semitism over time, and I won't go too deep into the history, but because we're in a college, we just wanted to bring some of the history to bear. It started really early on in the ancient world. And in particular, Jews were quite stubborn in assimilating. They wanted to have their religion, and they didn't necessarily want to convert to other religions, and that created a sense of otherness, and other groups started to look differently on that. In the early Christian times, Jews were charged with the death of Christ. So people believed that Jews should be held responsible for Jesus' death, and that was a source of hatred for many, many years. And I think it's important to note, in contemporary times, the church has done a lot to rectify and clarify that. So in the mid-1960s, there was a decree that outright declared that the Jews should not be held collectively responsible for the death of Christ. And especially in the Catholic Church, multiple popes have called out anti-Semitism as against Catholic values and against Christian values, and have voiced a very strong opinion on that. So while historically that has been a source of anti-Semitism, it's no longer taught in that way. In medieval times, Jews were often casted as demonic and an other. So what that meant was they were often blamed for many of the bad things that were happening in those times. Also, they were shifted into ghettos, limited in what they can do in society, and casted as others. And as you move through the Enlightenment, while Jews gained civil rights, anti-Semitism shifted to a racial ideology, where now, even though you were given an equal right and you could participate in society, there were questions about dual loyalties. Are you a real citizen? And also a lot of different types of hatred and beliefs that Jews might be controlling the government, might be controlling the economic and finances because of historically the roles that they had in society. And that culminated in World War II with the Nazis that elevated this to a scale that had never been seen before, where they systematized the racial profiling and the racial ideologies that casted Jews as beneath their society and ultimately led to the elimination, their goal to eliminate all Jews from their society and the murder of 6 million Jews. Post-World War II, anti-Semitism was a lot more taboo, but it was still prevalent. It took the form of limiting Jews' participation in different society activities, whether that be a country club or limiting admissions into different universities in the 1950s. That has shifted in today's world, but there are still a lot of different ways that anti-Semitism shows its face. One way, and I'm sure you've heard this, is do Jews control the media? Do they control Hollywood? What role do they play in controlling society? People joke about that, right? Is there some sort of conspiracy that Jews control different things? That is another way that anti-Semitism shows its face today. And what I've also been asked to do is just share a little bit about how Israel plays into this. So we're not going to go through it. We could spend an hour and a half, a day, a week, a class on Israel, and we don't have the time today to go through that. But what I did want to share is a little bit of the facts of Israel and how this impacts anti-Semitism in the United States, which is our focus. So the first is just some basic facts. Israel was, the post-World War I, the British Empire defeated the Ottoman Empire, and the Brits controlled the Mandate of Palestine. There was a lot of fighting between Arabs in that world and Jews, especially as Jews were emigrating towards Palestine, fleeing persecution, and in the aftermath of the Holocaust. In the 1940s, the Brits looked around and said, this is too much, we want out. And they started doing that even before the 1940s, and that led to the UN partition plan in 1947, where it was basically proposed that the Jews have a certain part of that land and that the Arabs have a different part of that land. The Jews agreed to it, the Arabs did not, and they attacked, and there was the War of Independence in 1948. Since then, there's been multiple wars and a lot of conflict. And so what exists today is Israel is a democratic society. It has 9 million people. 20% of its citizens are Arabs. They are a minority. They have full rights to participate in the democracy, so they vote. They are in the parliament. They serve as members of parliament. They serve in the judiciary. So that's the modern day Israel. And the other thing I wanted to note is that within the society, it is a democracy, and there's a lot of criticism within Israel about the government. So even before 2023 and 2022 in particular, there were some proposals from the Israeli government to change the way the judiciary would work, and that led to massive protests in the street. So criticism of Israel in no way is anti-Semitic. It's criticism of the government of Israel, I should say. And so now the big question, which obviously has been in the news, is what's happening in Palestine and the territories. So the West Bank and Gaza were captured by Israel in 1967 after the Six-Day War. For a host of reasons, it was annexed, and they took military control. And in the mid-1990s, as part of the Oslo Accords, led to elections in the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority was selected to govern, and then in Gaza, where Hamas was selected to govern in 2007. It's also important to note in 2005, Israel removed all Jewish residents from Gaza, and it was entirely governed by Hamas, yet militarily controlled by Israel. So those are the facts. So what we have is we have a lot of suffering and a lot of grievances and a lot of conflict because you have these two groups that are trying to live in one land and can't necessarily agree on what that looks like. So that's the situation today. And the reason why this is important for our conversation about anti-Semitism is 9 out of 10 American Jews feel that Israel is a part of their identity. So this is where it gets complicated, because on the one hand, Jews, Israeli Jews, American Jews, people of all faiths, criticize the Israeli government, their policies, how they behave, and how they act. That is not necessarily anti-Semitic. So I put that out there, and I wish I put a picture of some of the protests from 2022, because I think that would show just how passionate Israeli Jews are at criticizing their own government. But then on the other side of the chart, right, where you have conspiracy theories about, does Israel control parts of the world? Are the Mossad behind different operations? Even with Bondi, there were rumors online that the Mossad, seated the killer because it was a false flag operation to drive sympathy towards the Jews.
Mossad? Would you explain Mossad?
And the Mossad is the secret service for the Israeli government. So there's a lot of different conspiracy theories. And then the other piece, again, because Jews look at Israel as their ancestral homeland and have a deep connection to the land, a lot of comments and conversation that drive towards the elimination of the Jewish state in Israel are seen as anti-Semitic, because there's often includes violence towards Jews and calls for violence against Jews in that conversation. So on the left-hand side, criticism of the Israeli government, not anti-Semitic. Calling for the destruction of the Jewish people in Israel, holding Israel to a different standard than other countries, having conspiracy theories about what Israel does in the world stage, that tends to be anti-Semitic. And the last thing that I'll mention as I bring it back to American Jews is a lot of people, and this happens a lot on American campuses, try to hold Jews collectively responsible for the behaviors and the actions of the Israeli government. Hard to add up, right? Because on the one hand, you have Jews in the United States. They don't vote in the Israeli government. They don't select the prime minister. They don't have a say in it. But they are emotionally involved, and they have an identity that is linked to it. Yet on the other hand, they're being asked to have an opinion, comment, and be held responsible for those actions. So though that is typically considered anti-Semitic, to hold Jews collectively responsible for the actions of a foreign government. So with that, I wanted to just bring this back to some of the things that we see around what makes anti-Semitism different from other prejudices. So typically a prejudice looks at a group of people and calls them inferior, calls them dangerous, looks at them as criminals. And again, in anti-Semitism, there's a lot of differences where it's looking at Jews as secretly powerful and inferior at the same time, controlling, a lot of conspiracies around what the goal is and how they may or may not behave as a group, responsible for both capitalism and communism. So a lot of different tensions around how people see anti-Semitism and how they see other prejudices. So what I want to do is just bring this back to our first campaign. So how does this? I'm going to try to tie this back to the work that we do at the Blue Square Alliance. Those are the facts. Anti-Semitism. A year ago, when I took on this role, my wife said, "This is a hard problem. It hasn't been solved in 2,000 years," and that is the real fact. Is that this has been going on for many, many years, and Robert and our team are working very hard at trying to drive awareness of what this problem is. So in 2003, we launched our first messaging campaign, and it was on The Voice, and this is what it looked like. Hopefully the sound will work. So what we did in 2003 is we took the blue square, and this is where it originally came from, and we put it on the screen as if it was a dead pixel on your television that was just sitting there. And the idea was, it was just this small thing you couldn't help but take your eye away from. So that was representing the 2% of the population that are Jews. And again, making the point that that small population are subject to, in this stat it's at 69%, more recently it's over 70% of all hate crimes in the United States. So you have this small group that seems to be the focus of so much of that hate. Why is that? And that was the origination of where we brought the blue square to bear, which is to bring that fact really to society and to the public to make that really much more visible. That was the origination of the blue square. So what I want to do is just switch a little bit into the work that we do around data. And how do we monitor, how do we understand how anti-Semitism is transforming? And what I want to do is I want to show you some of the data from 2025 that we looked at that shows that even though I showed you over 2,000 years how anti-Semitism transformed, even in the last year, it transformed. Every day, it's taking on new coded language and shaping the dialogue that's happening online, on campuses, and in society in new ways. So this is where we work. This is actually at Gillette Stadium. We have what we call the command center, and we're responsible for researching what that conversation looks like and how anti-Semitism is shifting. So what you're seeing here are these big dashboards. What is that? So we monitor 1 billion social media posts a day, and we filter them down to roughly 200,000 to 300,000 that are anti-Semitic in nature. And so that is all English language, and it is a mix of things related to Israel and unrelated to Israel, which I'm going to get into in more detail. Yesterday, a YouTuber posted something that was insinuating that Jewish people in New Jersey are somehow defrauding the government. So if you were in our office today in that word cloud, you would see his name. You would see the YouTube piece that he had promoted. You would also see the funding site that recently shut him down, and you'd see Tucker Carlson's name because Tucker Carlson has been promoting his video. So that's the type of thing on a daily basis that we see shifting, right? Because that's going viral. I think that had almost 10 million views last we checked. So it went pretty viral. We look at the specific content, images, and text, and we have the ability to go deeper into categorization, classification, and then we're building out more AI capabilities just to understand sentiment and if something's hateful, something is pro a post or against a post. So when we take our own posts on social media, we're curious when we have comments, how many people are saying something positive and how many people are saying something negative. So we have the ability to classify that and quantify and understand. So 2 weeks ago at the Super Bowl, we had some folks on Twitter go viral around the work that we do saying, hey, Robert Kraft is surveying Americans on their thoughts. That is not what's happening. These are third-party tools. It's called BrandWatch. It is something that most companies use. So if you're Coca-Cola and you want to know how are people talking about Coca-Cola today, you would hire BrandWatch, and it allows you to monitor social media. We are not doing anything on the dark web. We are not necessarily looking for people that write very hateful things that don't reach a lot of people. Our quest is to understand what are the majority of Americans seeing and how is that shaping what they believe. So it's a different thing than looking for a needle in a haystack or trying to have a relationship with the FBI or anything like that. This is broad-based conversation monitoring, not necessarily looking for a threat. I want to make that clear, because when you look at this and we call ourselves the command center, it makes it seem like that is what we're up to, but it's much more sorting on volume and conversation than it is on specific hateful things. Just because we're on the microphones, I'm going to keep. Could you hold that? Thank you. Because I know we have folks online, and that way we'll grab it. But please hold it. I'm eager to hear it. So this is a breakdown of what we do at the command center. So we just talked about the social listening that we do. So the 1 billion posts. We also do quantitative research. We run one of the largest studies on anti-Semitic attitudes across the United States. We published our last report in the fall, and we're just going back into market research to understand how those anti-Semitic attitudes changed. And we do see shifts every 6 months in what Americans think around Jews and around anti-Semitic attitudes. And the last thing is, from that research, we often find things that we want to go and explore. Right now, we're curious about how young people, how their attitudes around anti-Semitism are different than older people. So we will hold focus groups, we'll do in-depth interviews, we'll do other types of qualitative research, online communities, just to understand how are things being shaped and what are people thinking. And what do we do with that is we design media campaigns. So we're best known for our Super Bowl ads. We had an ad, I'll re-show it in a moment, just a few weeks ago at the Super Bowl. It was our third Super Bowl ad. But we believe that persuasive messaging will help combat anti-Semitism. The other thing that we do is we partner. So it's great being here today on campus. We also partner with the United Negro College Fund, and we host unity dinners with Black students and Jewish students just to exchange and do knowledge sharing. We partner with Hillel. We partner with all sorts of different organizations as activation to take our data and to take our assets and bring them to drive awareness and understanding around Jewish hate. So one of the things we found in our market research, and this has been pretty consistent, is when you look at Americans, there's a small group on the left that are haters. So those are folks that are posting online, are writing really hateful things, are making jokes that are very anti-Semitic. Small part of the population. They do get amplified, but it's not necessarily our focus. And on the right side, there's about 30% of the population that we call allies. Those are the folks that understand this issue. If they see something, they would likely stand up and say something and stop it. That's the right-hand side. In the middle, you have nearly half of Americans that are just unengaged on this topic. Either they're unaware, or they're not entirely sure what it means, or what they would do in the moment if they saw something hateful. And that's our focus. So that's a very different focus than a lot of the other work that's being done out there, that's out there being done, which is really around focusing on the haters. We're not necessarily thinking that we're going to be able to shape Candace Owens or Nick Fuentes or some other folks that are very prolific anti-Semites. We're going to be able to shape their discourse. We're focused on the majority of Americans that just are unaware. And another stat that I don't think is up here is nearly half of Americans don't know anyone Jewish. So we have a familiarity challenge. So we have 90% of that group are not very familiar with anti-Semitism, 62% don't think it's a problem, and 72% don't feel any societal pressure to stand up to Jewish hate if they saw it. So very much unengaged, not very involved. Our goal is to activate them and drive awareness and ultimately give them the tools to stand up to hate. And this is the way that we do it. We see basically a journey which starts with awareness and then builds empathy, ultimately asks people, would you intend to do something? And then ideally creating action in the moment and then cultural change. That is the journey that we see that we want to take people through in that unengaged group to drive that awareness all the way to the cultural change. So this was one of the ads we had from last year, and I'm going to share it, and I'm hopeful, if we had questions, I'd ask what you thought about it, but I want you to see it. This is one of the ways that we drive that persuasive messaging to bring those unengaged folks down that journey.
Mom, what's that?
Nothing. Just get in the car. Let's go. Come on.
Who did that?
Get in right now.
You painted or something? Hi, Mr. Cody.
So a couple of things in that ad, just to bring it full circle. So some of the things that we think about on a daily basis, like any good marketing organization, is what are the key messages that we want to give to those folks in the unengaged. So we had the statistic in there around Jewish hate. We had something that was visibly harming an American. That's another part of our persuasive messaging toolbox. We also showed somebody who was an ally showing what they did to stand up to the Jewish hate and do something in support of somebody who is experiencing hate. So that ad had a lot of the persuasive elements of what we're trying to drive, which is that awareness, it's a problem, the impact, it harms people in your community. When you see it, what are the things that you can do to show allyship? That's the fundamental thesis that we have around persuasive messaging, and we do that in various forms. So we call that ad Tony. When we test that ad, we do a lot of market testing. It scores really well on those areas that we're trying to drive, which is awareness, familiarity, and intent to stand up if someone saw something. So I want to switch it over to some of the data. So this is the conversation around anti-Semitism over the last year. Over the last 2 years through last summer. What you can see is after October 7th, it spikes and then it's elevated. So we saw 2 billion posts over that time. It had 10 trillion impressions, and it was up where the amount of anti-Semitic conversation that we saw after October 7th of 2023 was equal to the 14 years combined. So when you talk about what's happening in the world, this is definitely at an elevated level. Over that time, this is typically what we saw in the word cloud. This is the typical topics. These are the 20 most used phrases. So this is just to give you a sense for the magnitude of what we are monitoring and what we're seeing in our command center that we're trying to combat. What I want to do is bring you through a little bit more of a deeper dive in what that data looked like last year. So when we did our end-of-year report, this is what we found as the 5 numbers that defined anti-Semitism. So I'm going to start in the top right, but we saw roughly, it was somewhat flat, where there was 10% more users talking about anti-Semitism. We saw a slight decrease in the conversation around Israel, and that was primarily driven after the ceasefire in October of 2025. So slight decrease. So we saw more people engaged, a slight decrease in the Israeli conversation. But when we took out Israel or the word Zionism from our query, we saw a 30% rise. And we're going to go through what that looks like. We also saw 67% increase in claims that Jews control powerful institutions or the media. So again, back to that shifting, we're seeing a different conversation emerging and different anti-Semitic tropes happening. And then we also saw more reach. So even though the volume was down slightly, the algorithms are picking it up, and its impact, and more people are seeing them. So that's what last year looked like. And so just to bring it back, we're calling it not really a decline. It declined slightly, but when you look at it over the last 10 years, it's still very elevated compared to prior to 2023. We have a long way to go to get the volume of anti-Semitic conversation online down to pre-2023 levels. So that's the first thing, because our assumption is after the ceasefire, would we see a dramatic drop in conversation? There was a drop. It was not dramatic. The second thing that we saw is that it's less Israel-centered, and we saw a shift markedly around Labor Day, and I'll show you that in a moment. We saw more conversation around conspiracy theory, Holocaust language, and then AI played a role. And I'm going to walk through all of that. So this is what the conversations looked like in 2025 overall. So the point here is when you look at these lines, we did the math, so you don't have to, but they're roughly the same. So we saw a slight decrease around 7% in the conversation. If you want to know what the spikes were in 2025, we had the Israel and Iran fighting in the summer, and that's what drove that spike. And then you see a spike in September and October, and that was driven by the assassination of Charlie Kirk and a lot of conversation around conspiracy theories that Jews might have been behind it. We also saw conversation in October, primarily related to the ceasefire, but at the same time, we had a lot of conversation in the US around that time, there was a leak around the young Republicans who had some anti-Semitic texts. Tucker Carlson hosted Nick Fuentes last fall. All of that drove anti-Semitic conversation in the fall. But roughly speaking, the volume was about the same. So again, when you look at that non-Israel conversation, if you look at last year, we had a spike in January around the inauguration of President Trump, and that was related to Elon Musk doing what many considered a Nazi salute around that time. So anything related to Holocaust imagery, we will pick up as potentially anti-Semitic. That was debated at the time, what was his intention, but all of that conversation is something that we monitor. And then when you get to September, you can see that spike around the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and then you can see a dramatic rise that persisted through the back half of last year and has also been consistent this year. So when you look at, again, this is excluding Israel, the conversation was up 30%, and it really spiked right around Labor Day, right around the time of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And as I mentioned, there was a variety of factors that kept it elevated. But what we saw was it's not Israel that's driving the conversation anymore. It's shifted to something in the US related to Holocaust language, conspiracy theories, and other types of dynamics that are being echoed and amplified through a variety of media. So, as a data person, this is interesting to us, right? What's behind it is things that we're trying to unpack more and more every day. So the other trend that we saw was that conspiracy theories grew. They connected a lot of the anti-Semitic conversation that we saw online. Those conspiracy theories break down into these three groups. The first is claims that Jews or Zionists control various parts of our society, whether that be financial institutions, the media, all of those types of claims. That's one big conspiracy theory that we're seeing online. The second is that Jews are eroding values that are important to the United States or to other countries. So that's another conspiracy theory that Jews are responsible for a moral decline. And the third is that Jews cause harm. So those are the conspiracy theories that we see. As I mentioned, there's also these false flag type conspiracy theories, but all of those are a big part of what's driving the anti-Semitic conversation last year. The other piece that we saw was a lot of Holocaust language. That grew extensively last year, especially when you excluded Israel. So the use of the word Gestapo was up 228%, Nazi was up 56%, and Hitler was up slightly by 6%. Why does this matter? It matters because any time that we take terminology that's related to the Holocaust and take it out of context, it often starts to become more normalized, and it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as what happened during the Holocaust. So if you think a police officer is behaving like a Nazi, that's a very different thing than someone being a Nazi in 1942. Their intent is different, and how they treat people is actually different. So those comparisons tend to, while they're being used as a generalized insult, it tends to erode the historical significance of what happened in the Holocaust. So the more that we see this in normal life, the more that it makes the Holocaust less unique and devalues and makes it less important what actually happened during that time. But no doubt we are seeing those comparisons and that language being used more and more as political shorthand. So that's another part that drove the conversation. And everyone's favorite topic, AI. So how has AI shifted the conversation? So one of the ways we saw it, first off, was AI becomes an authority. Everyone here, when you're writing, I don't know if you're writing a paper, if you're allowed to, when you're doing research, when you're trying to understand something, it's very easy to go to AI and ask a question. You see that especially on social media. I don't know if you guys are on Instagram or Facebook, they're constantly pushing Meta AI. In Twitter, we have Grok AI. And so people, when they see something, they'll ask Grok, what do you think? Is this real? Give any facts. So AI is being used more and more as a fact source. So that's the first piece that we saw around the use of AI and anti-Semitism. Grok had some issues and would often say things. There's been some famous issues in the last year with Twitter around Grok calling out different types of anti-Semitic tropes. It's been fixed, but that is one piece that's out there. AI as an authority. The other thing we saw with AI, especially with the launch of Sora, within days, we saw Sora being used. Sora is the image creator, the image generator that OpenAI from ChatGPT launched last year. So you can go in and you can ask it to make a video. You can ask it to do different things. There were not a lot of controls on it when it first came out. And we saw many, many people use it to create anti-Semitic videos and anti-Semitic images. We saw 216% increase in AI-generated anti-Semitic content after Sora was launched. So that was another way that AI was used last year in the conversation around anti-Semitism. And the third is some of those nefarious actors, those haters, created their own chatbots that were perceived to be authoritative content, but propagated many, many anti-Semitic tropes. There was one on Twitter that we found called Gab AI. It was trained on all of the anti-Semitic content over the last 2,000 years that I shared with you earlier. So if you ask Gab AI a question, right, were Jews responsible for the Black Plague in the medieval times? Were the Jews responsible for the Holocaust? It would have a very different answer than what's accurate. And so within days of us publishing our article on Gab AI, it was actually taken off Twitter, but it is still active. So you have different ways that AI is being used in the conversation around anti-Semitism, as an authority, as something that can propagate using imagery, and again, as something that can bring back conspiracy theories and really look at like the authority. And so what I want to do is bring it to this past month. This was our latest ad, and I wanted to bring this back to show it to you.
Oh, look at. Did you see that? Should we tell him? It's so bad. Oh my gosh. Stop.
Do not listen to that.
Thank you, man.
I know how it feels.
So all of this is to say, we do all of this research to help, again, inform the ads that we bring together. So one of the ways that we were able to do that is we saw a 25% increase online in the use of the word dirty Jew. So that's one of the ways that we're bringing the data back into the persuasive messaging that we push online. The other thing that we found in our research is that young people are more overt anti-Semitic beliefs than older generations, and that they're more likely to have seen anti-Semitism. So the Gen Z is 3 times more likely than older generations to see anti-Semitism, and twice as likely as older generations to say it's not a problem. So that's something that we're still trying to add up within our understanding, is you're seeing it, but often they're seeing it as a joke or something that doesn't matter or something that is just normalized. And so part of our research was also asking us to focus on young people. So that's the tie together between the data that we're bringing together and the persuasive messaging. So before we end, I wanted to show 2 more things. One of them was just some of the research on how our ads work. So when I bring back that journey, right, when we do our research, people that see our ads are more likely to be familiar with anti-Semitic events, more likely to think it's a major problem, and more likely to speak up for Jews that are experiencing hate. So this gives us a lot more confidence. Like sometimes we had one visitor in our office and they asked me and they said, "Isn't it hard to look at this data all day?" Well, this is the part that I think is inspiring, is that we're seeing pathways that we can actually make a difference. And the persuasive messaging and the research that we're doing is impactful. And while we get a lot of positive reactions, we also get some negative reactions. So this was the last ad. We did this research about a week after the Super Bowl. So that sticky note ad that you saw was our Super Bowl ad. On the left-hand side, you can see some positive reactions that we get. And on the right-hand side, we get hateful reactions. So this is the type of analysis that we do after the ad to continue to improve the work that we do. So we don't just take the facts that we know that people who see the ads are more likely to stand up to hate the way that we want. We also try to make sure that we're constantly looking for how we can improve. And with that, I want to bring it back to something I mentioned earlier, which is around partnerships. So we talked about the data driving media and the data driving different partnerships, like we had with the United Negro College Foundation, with Hillel's on campus. Another partnership that we had was with the Appeal Conscious, and we ran a program across hundreds of churches in different places of faith last September, where we had a stand-up Sunday, and all of the sermons that day were related to fighting anti-Semitism. So I just wanted to bring that back as we close it out.
now is our time to stand united and to drown out all the haters with the wonderful reminder of the love that God has given each and every one of us.
On this Stand Up Against Hate Sunday, we unite in prayer, pledging to combat any type of hatred, especially anti-Semitism.
Today, we're calling you and asking you to be participants, to reject prejudice, no matter what their religion, creed, status.
Stand Up Sunday is important because people in the United States do not realize how many houses of worship are being attacked and people of faith who are being attacked.
We are mobilizing 1.5 million Americans to stand up to faith-based hate, Jewish hate, hate of all kinds, and show that is not tolerable, that is not acceptable in this country.
Destroying a house of worship of any faith community is really targeting the jugular vein of that community.
Every faith, every religious tradition, two fundamental messages: love your neighbor as yourself, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. For us to stand in solidarity is absolutely the right thing to do.
Through our teachings in Matthew, we learn about the love for our neighbors, for those who may look or worship differently.
I think that the beauty of the message is in its simplicity. We're going to stand up to hate. Everybody can recognize the importance of that.
Our mission is to share God's love. It makes sense for us to be opposed to hate of any kind.
All our churches were behind this effort, and it made me feel good. And that people really do care.
It's so meaningful that we're standing here today and standing up to hatred of people of all faith and anti-Semitism. We're standing up right here. It's a symbol of rebirth and renewal.
So with that was what I wanted to close out on, is just all the different ways that we take our data and we drive action across the community. So I think I have a slide that just says questions. Oh, thank you. And I appreciate everyone joining us, but if there's any questions, I know there's one gentleman, but I think he had to take off. And if there's none, that's okay, but. Yeah, absolutely.
Would you just use the mic because it will be recorded?
How do you differentiate talks about the state of Israel as a political topic with Jewish hatred?
It's a great question. So the question was, because I don't think it got on the microphone, is how do we differentiate between conversation about the state of Israel with Jewish hatred? And so it's something that we have two ways to do it, one of which we're doing today, one of which we have to improve. So the first is a lot of our search is keyword-based. So we can actually look at those billion posts and we can say, what are the things that don't mention Israel, that don't mention Zionism, but do mention a bunch of topics related to anti-Semitism, do mention something around Jewish hatred, do mention conspiracy theories. So that is one way, just very basically, we can sift it apart like a Google search, right? So very simple logic. But to go deeper into something that is, I think your question was more, what if it's just criticism of the Israel government or something that's more hateful, like on that slide that I had with the 3 boxes, right? That's something that we're working on right now. We're working with researchers out of the University of Washington and linguistics scientists to really build out AI and LLMs that help us make that determination. And it's challenging because even as a human, we can sit here, I can bring 20 tweets and we can debate which one's anti-Semitic or not. And there's a definition of what is anti-Semitic, and we're also working with a researcher who's now at NYU to decode anti-Semitism and break it down into its linguistic form and then classify it. I think there's 38 different ways to classify it, including the pieces on the right that I had, which was anti-Semitic conversation around Israel versus just criticism of the Israeli government. So that is the accepted guidebook that we have from this researcher out of NYU of how to break it down. And then what we're doing is we're trying to bring in LLMs to have context so that we can take all of that and be able to classify language as hateful or not hateful. And it's never going to be perfect, so sometimes the algorithm might say, I'm not sure, right? And that is something that we're working on building right now. We have some early algorithms that do it at about, the accuracy is a little over 80%. We want to bring that up because if we take thousands of tweets, we don't think that that's a good enough ability to classify something that to that level of accuracy. But that is our goal. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So yeah, it's hard. It's absolutely hard. That's a great question.
Thank you for that presentation, Stephen. As you look at the tweets and all this information you're gathering, are you able to get a sense of how much of this is domestic, how much of this is coming from overseas? We certainly know internationally players that are very deliberate in feeding kind of the social media world and,
Yep.
and this information and what that looks like.
It's a great question. So the question was, because I don't know if the microphone's working. How much? It is? Okay, great. So it's something we're leaning into. We don't have great fidelity on international conversation yet. We have better fidelity on if something's domestic or not. Where it's coming from is a little harder for us. We typically look at only English, so that limits us because we think a lot of the conversation might be in foreign languages. There's other groups that we are aware of, that we talk with, that are looking more and more at other languages to get a sense of what the international conversation looks like. But I think to your point, the question is how much are foreign actors influencing these conversations? I think that's the other question you raised. We're starting to look into understanding more and more of that. So to give you an example, we just got some early data that showed that when the conversation erupted after our Super Bowl ad, between 20 to 30% of the commentators that are out there are inauthentic accounts, bots. When we did the research and we asked our partners to go deeper into where those are coming from, the majority of it is still domestic. So we don't have, when it's the conversations about our brand, we see that mostly as domestic, but I think your conversation is globally how much of the anti-Semitism conversation that's happening in English is coming from the US versus outside the US. We don't have a great way yet of getting to that fidelity. X just launched a location tool that actually drove some anti-Semitism in an odd way because some accounts were classified as in Israel, and then it created a whole conversation last fall. But even that wasn't accurate enough for us to trust. So we don't have a great way to do it yet, but it's something that we want to invest in. It's a great question.
Is your research able to identify like dog whistles and how that plays into like anti-Semitism and its prevalence?
Yeah, so we do try to look for that. So one of the things that we do is we work with a lot of different researchers and we do our own scans to understand what are those new coded languages so that we can actually include in our queries so that we can see more and more of those types of activity. So it's a great question. But that is a lot of what we try to keep current on, which is what are the new ways that people are calling things out. I think last year a new tag was people would say, check their early life. So if we were talking about somebody online, they'd say, check their early life. And that was basically saying, go to Wikipedia and try to see if they're Jewish. Right? So that was a new one for us. And it's, again, something that we're now monitoring. We wrote about it, and it was becoming larger and larger. So back to that conversation, that throughout time, anti-Semitism transforms, and that's something that we see in real time as well.
Hi, I just found the statistic, well, two things. I found the statistic where you said more than half of Americans haven't met someone who is Jewish. I'm from Brookline. Do you know that town by any chance? Very Jewish town. I grew up closer to 4 synagogues than I did to 1 Catholic church. So I just found that statistic very interesting. And another thing I wanted to ask is, how is comedy used in anti-Semitism? Because I want to say it was 2014. 2024 was when they found these tunnels from a Jewish temple in New York specifically. And I was talking to my friends about it who are from Israel, and they were like, oh, haha, it's so funny. But at the same time, I saw people online using that about comparing Jewish people to rats running in tunnels. So I'm curious how you see comedy being used in anti-Semitism.
It's a great question. So first off, it was just under half. I think it was like 46% of the people we surveyed don't know anyone Jewish. But again, to your point, it's like in the lived experience that we have in an urban environment, it's less believable. But when you think about the vast majority of the United States, it's a little different, especially when my dad, for example, grew up in a very small town, and I don't think everyone knew every day who was Jewish and who wasn't. It wasn't something that they were very vocal about. So I think that they don't knowingly know someone Jewish, I think, is another factor there. In terms of comedy, it's not something that we have seen it a little bit. It's more recent. I'd say more recently we've seen it in some of the Netflix specials and people saying things. That's where we see it as being anti-Semitic. We see people make jokes. We see, especially Gen Z, dismiss things that may be considered are considered anti-Semitic as jokes. So a joke that says, "Oh, they're Jewish, they must control the media," or "Oh, they're Jewish, they're good with money," right? Like those are the types of things that we see, and those do bleed into popular culture and comedians and things like that. So that is, we are monitoring more and more podcasts. That's something that we're trying to get a better handle on. That is certainly within the walls of our communication. But in terms of comedy, we definitely see an increase, but it's not something that we can't like bring in all of the comedy acts to just analyze it, but we are colloquially seeing that. And we see it typically through the conversation about the comedy. So that's how we will pick it up, because if something, again, is being talked about in media, if there's a new Netflix special and someone said something, or Jerry Seinfeld does something that's related to this topic, it'll get picked up in our media feeds. And so that's the way that we're able to monitor it. So we don't directly like look at comedic acts or something like that. But again, back to the like rats in tunnels and things like that, we'll look for that coded language if it becomes prevalent.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So,
Thank you very much.
excellent.
You were gonna say something?
No, I'm great. Thank you guys. Thanks everyone for coming.